Excellent. All right. So today we're going to be chatting about integrating empathy on Agile teams. And you might be wondering, like, empathy, what is that? We're going to get to that in a little bit. But first, just a little bit about me. So you see a whole bunch of stuff down there at the bottom. I started my career in strategic communications and copywriting. So I learned some technical stuff around empathy. And then since 2009, I've led a company called Corgi Bytes. And we specialize in software modernization and maintenance, launched the online community, Legacy Code Rocks. So if you also like mending, you can join us there. And then a few years ago, I launched a company called Hardware that really focuses on how do we reverse engineer collaboration, right? How do we get this magical thing called Agile? Because I've experienced how awesome it is, but there's also a lot of failed Agile rollouts. And, just kind of looking at the difference, I've seen some kind of very specific things that we're going to go over today. And I think empathy really is kind of the missing ingredient. It's so obvious that we kind of overlook it. All right. So this is a quote from McKinsey from just over a year ago. And, post-pandemic, interacting is easier than ever. We can get together, we can talk, we can have these conversations. We've got Slack, we've got Teams, we've got all this stuff that we can interact with. But true, productive, value creating collaboration, that's not as easy, right? So separating this idea of interacting and collaboration is really key, because what we're going for is collaboration. And what I see a lot is kind of some Agile meetings sometimes end up like this, right? And so this is a conversation that we had with one of our clients, and it's just saying they were rolling out SAFe and just saying our pie planning just isn't working because the software and hardware teams can't negotiate. They're bitter and they're resentful, and they just end up blaming the other team. And if this is the way that our Agile meetings and interactions are working, then of course we're not going to be able to take advantage and we're not going to see the results that we're looking for. So there's actually 4 types of interactions, right? So there's making decisions, solving problems, coordinating tasks, and sharing information. So when we break those down, we can think of those kind of like I describe it as clashing, cluttering, or collaborating, right? So when we're thinking about those different types of interactions, what do they look like? So the first one is clashing, right? So these birds here, they are just like not collaborating at all. There's rivalries, territorialism. There's a lot of contempt. People in contempt is feeling superior than someone else. We see this on an individual level, but then also on an interdepartmental level. A lot of times I see kind of friction between testing and engineering, or hardware and software teams, or marketing and development, right? There's just a lot of distress. It's not fun working in this environment, and there's just gridlock, like decisions can't get made. Next, we have cluttering, and I love this picture because the dog is so happy, right? And so I describe this as kind of, there's mismatched goals, right? So the dog is like, yay. And this can sometimes be executive teams, right? Where it's like the CEO or, other people who are doing the strategy are like, everything's amazing. But then, people who are working on more of the details, who are doing some of the implementation, are like, I don't think you see how much work there is in actually doing this, right? There's a lot of activity, but there's not a lot of like productive output. There can just be a sense of kind of overwhelm and chaos, and just schedules feel cluttered. The backlogs feel cluttered. Like there's just so much going on. So operating in a sustainable pace just feels impossible. And then we have collaborating. So, there's different teams, but all of them are pollinating ideas, right? With collaboration, the qualities there are we understand each other. There's an accurate understanding across domains. We also trust each other. There's a sense of mutual support. We're helping each other. And then most important, we're co-creating together. So we're creating as a group what no one person could ever create alone. And that is where the magic of Agile happens. So let's take a look at some of the popular frameworks, right? So this is a way to kind of assess on your team. We're looking at Scrum. So these are the different types of, interactions that we typically have with different members of our groups. There's other ones on here, code reviews, things like that I didn't put. But, we're making decisions, solving problems, coordinating tasks, and sharing information. And so we can kind of look at this. It's like, are things, clashing? Are they cluttering, or are they collaborating? And so this is a way just to kind of get a sense of where we are, to then figure out where we want to go. And, a lot of times we think about how safe, different people, oh, where'd it go? Sorry about that. Different people think that safe doesn't work. And I think, working in a complex enterprise, needs its own problems. So I don't know that necessarily safe is the problem. It's a framework, but it just introduces so many more opportunities because there's so many more people. And then just there's a lot more interaction. So the probability of something going awry just is higher. So it requires a lot more intention. It requires that culture being aligned. And I have seen safe rollouts that work well, but it requires a lot of intention and everybody being on the same page and being able to collaborate and communicate. And so this is where empathy comes in, because Agile can only work when there's successful collaboration. And collaboration, it's an outcome. And so we can reverse engineer that. So this is the model that I kind of came up with. And empathy is the engine that converts compassionate communication into collaboration. So let's walk through this just a little bit. So we've got our outputs that we've already identified, right? And so collaboration is that useful work that we're going for, the accurate understanding, the trust, the mutual support, the co-creation, that's the outcome. That's what we're shooting for. And then we have the mechanism. So what is it that we can kind of design that will help us get those outputs? And we'll go over kind of these 6 different domains and kind of attributes in just a moment. But there's several different places that we can look at to figure out and kind of tweak where that might give us more of the outputs that we're looking for. And, an engine doesn't really do anything unless it has fuel, right? It needs those inputs. And the way that I think about it is that we've got kind of 2 different energy, we've got potential and kinetic energy, if we remember back to our 4th grade, science classes. So the potential energy is compassion. And this is fostering a sense of presence and warmth, recognizing our common humanity. We have this comforting intention to do something, right? But it's an intention. The way I describe it is that you can go sit on a mountaintop your entire life and cultivate the most compassion ever. But if you're not actually in the world and making that, compassion active, then it just remains potential. And kinetic energy to me is the communication. It is the thing that is just flowing. It's moving, right? There's a lot there. And so when compassion and communication work and kind of that is the input, right? That is going to give us the fuel to then power the engine of empathy. And then we can get those outputs. And just a quick note, I have this down at the very bottom. So this is a deterministic model. So, when we do think of a literal engine, we can very certainly know, okay, if I do this thing, I will get this result. I use this metaphor because it's easy to kind of wrap your brain around, but empathy is actually a complex adaptive dynamic system. So there's just a lot going on. So you're never going to be able to know with very precise certainty, but this is a way that you can just kind of model it and think about it. But for people out there who know about systems theory, just recognize that, there's a reason that this is simplified. All right, so let's look at empathy, right? So this is the way that I describe empathy. This is my definition. Empathy is not consistently defined across the research. People use a lot of different definitions, and I have other presentations that go into that, but the way I describe it is kind of value neutral. It's the mechanism that humans evolved so that we can collaborate and solve complex problems, right? So we are a hypersocial species, right? We work together to create things and build things, and originally like take down woolly mammoths and things like that. And so empathy is definitely a mechanism that kind of came about through evolution, and it defines our species. But there's some specific places that we can tinker to get the results that we want. But in the end, empathy leads to collaboration. That's the reason that we have it. So these are the 6 elements of empathy that I mentioned before. All right, so first we have resonating. So this is creating an emotional connection, right? This is what some people think of as empathy when they think of empathy, right? It is identifying with someone's emotion and kind of feeling it yourself a little bit. And this is an important part, right? We do need to kind of connect on that emotional level. Next is regulating. And this is something that isn't typically thought of when we think of empathy, but it's important, right? Because when we think of being able to actively listen or take someone else's perspective or figure out what's going on, if our first instinct is, I want to say something really mean to you, or, I want to punch you in the face or something. I've heard some people say that. Then, that's going to be really hard, right? You're not going to foster that sense of connection. So being able to control our own impulses, not just our behavior, but also recognizing kind of what initial thoughts are coming to mind and thinking, is that actually accurate? I sometimes describe those as like the stories that we make up in our minds and thinking through those. So being able to have some emotional regulation is important too. Next, we have critical thinking. This is sometimes referred to as cognitive empathy. And this is reasoning. This is really just like thinking things through. This is the perspective taking. This is the analytical skill. And this is important because if we're only led by our emotions, right, we can open ourselves up to more manipulation. We can, make decisions that, may not be best for, kind of broader social groups, right? So being able to kind of balance the emotional connection also with the critical thinking, right? That's where we get the best of empathy. We also have reflecting. So, there is a trope out there that empathy, especially in kind of science fiction and superheroes, that empathy is some kind of like telepathy, right? Where I immediately know how you're feeling. I don't have to check. I just can assess and, with a high degree of certainty. We're actually not very good at like knowing exactly how people are feeling. When it comes to strangers, we're way better than chance. But, there's a ceiling, there's kind of an upper limit. On average, the people that we are absolutely closest to, we only know exactly how they're feeling about 35% of the time. And the best people who have ever been measured ever are at about 50%. So if you feel like you're getting it wrong most of the time, guess what? You're normal and you're average. There are different methodologies that, kind of purport that they are much higher, but those are based on some methodologies that have since been criticized and not as accurate. Next, we have responding, right? So this is that sharing support. This is that pro-social behavior. This is like working together to develop trust, to help each other, to understand each other, right? So in that way, we're not in this alone. We are working as a team. And then finally, we have resourcing. And so empathy is all about motivation. It's less of a character trait. It's more of what situation are you in? And, depending on the situation, this is where culture comes into things a lot. And so, the number one reason that in like a lot of the research shows that the number one reason that Agile rollouts fail is there's not organizational culture that supports it. And I think this is critical, right? So if we can think about empathy more as like, a motivation construct, then what are the things that are going to motivate people to actually act in the ways that we know work when it comes to Agile? And like I mentioned before, this is kind of a system. So everything kind of is connected to each other. And then, the way this works is that we have these kind of like micro moments. So as we're going about our day, we can lean into empathy and kind of connect emotionally. We can reason, we can do all of these things, or we can kind of move away where we're driving that disconnection. But a lot of this has to do with motivation. But thinking through like all of these different small points in your day, empathy isn't this like one big sweeping characteristic. It really is developed in these small interactions that happen with other people all the time. And so when we think about all of those interactions that we just went over, those are great opportunities. Those are kind of some of the micro moments that we can think of specifically in the workplace. All right. So now we know what empathy is. And, let's think through. I always like to present some like really practical advice on how to kind of get started and, move these ideas into action, because theory is great. Now we kind of have a concept of what we're talking about, but, similar to how we don't want to just sit on a mountaintop being compassionate, we want to move this stuff into action. So let's go over a few things. All right. So first is increasing compassion. As we talked about, that's our potential energy. It's absolutely essential, because if you don't have this fuel, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to have the capacity to collaborate, right? So again, if we're thinking about this as like fuel for our empathy tank, right, being able to cultivate compassion is an important part. So there's a couple of different things. First is self-compassion. Right. And so Kristen Neff has a lot of research on this. She's got some books on it, but there's an immense amount of evidence that if we want to be compassionate with others, we have to start with ourselves. And so there's kind of three different characteristics of what self-compassion looks like. So first is, when you're making a mistake, this happens all the time, right? Like instead of flagellating and like beating yourself up and, self-shaming, comforting yourself like you would comfort a friend. So, the first thing I think is just noticing the difference. Like how are you talking to yourself, or what, kind of feelings are arising when you're, when you do make a mistake, and when you like, how do you internalize that? And then can you change that so that, thinking of yourself as someone who is just as deserving of compassion and kindness as the people around you. And this can be so hard for us. I know for me, I used to use perfectionism as like really a driving force. There's a lot of evidence that can be really detrimental. And I felt it. Like I had some really big health issues. And a lot of it was just like, kind of whipping myself like a horse, like, you can do it. Come on, be better, be better, be better. And, when I did make a mistake, I took it really, really, really hard. And I was really mean to myself. So learning this self-compassion technique, it really does help give you the energy to then help other people as well. Another is recognizing that you're not alone or broken. Other people make mistakes. This is that common humanity where, we make mistakes, things happen, right? And so when that happens, like not over identifying with it, right? And so being able to kind of step out of it a little bit, look at things kind of as a system rather than getting so sucked into kind of this vortex of self-shaming. So self-compassion is kind of the best place to start. So if you're looking for kind of ways to, optimize your empathy and optimize your collaboration, therefore your team, starting with yourself first is a great place. And the nice thing about that is you don't need to ask for your manager's permission, right? You don't need to, have, this big coordination. Like it's just kind of a switch that happens with yourself. And there's a ton of research out there. So you can kind of research how to do some of these things. So the next is a loving kindness meditation. And this has been shown, this specific practice has been shown to have a really strong positive correlation with being able to empathize, right? So there are other meditations that help you kind of increase your mindfulness, which is being able to notice kind of what are these opportunities. But when it comes to compassion, this loving kindness meditation is the one that's really, really effective. And so the way this works is that you start with yourself. You kind of start on the inside of this circle. And then with that kind of warm, loving intention and recognizing kind of the common humanity, you walk through this kind of mantra of, may I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I live with ease. And after you've done that, you kind of let that sink in, you take a deep breath, and then you think of someone who's really close or familiar with you. So this might be a family member or a really close friend, a coworker that you just really love working with. And then you go through the same kind of 4 different qualities. So may they be safe, may they be happy, may they be healthy, may they live with ease, right? And so then you kind of move that kind of conceptualization between yourself and other people out a little bit. So someone who is a stranger, right? So maybe somebody that you, the cashier at the grocery store or something like that, or someone who's in another department that you don't know very well. You can also look at, and then looking at strained relationships. So someone that, maybe you work with a lot, but it's just like you butt heads a lot. Right. So that can be, someone, and, being cautious here that, strained relationships, if there is something that evokes really, really strong feelings, that's something you'll probably want to work through with a therapist. You don't want to kind of re-trigger a trauma. But if it's kind of like a friction, like we're not working really well together, then that's really useful. And then finally, we can move that out to groups. So, may everyone in my department or on my team, may everyone at the organization, may everyone in my community, right? And, moving out further and further until eventually you're thinking about the whole world. And so this might seem kind of woo-woo, right? And it's a practice actually that works, that's kind of very familiar with people who practice Buddhism, but on a secular level, there's just an immense amount of evidence that this specific practice goes a really long way to cultivating compassion. All right, let's look now at communication. So this is our kinetic energy. And okay, I know this is a lot, but we're going to walk through this, right? And given kind of the time frame, I didn't want to do a whole big build. All right, so let's first look at the boxes in the center, the black boxes. So this is the nice thing to think of is that the way that we communicate with humans, can be computationally looked at exactly the same way that we get a bit of information from one computer to another, right? And so there was a guy named Claude Shannon who in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s really spent a lot of time thinking about this problem. And so he developed what he called the generalized communication system. There's a lot of math behind it. It's really cool. And there was a guy named Warren Weaver who was like, oh my gosh, you're really smart and brilliant. And this can work for not just computers, but also other people. So when I was getting my degree in marketing and kind of looking at strategic communications, what I was really surprised with was that the Shannon-Weaver model was presented to me. And then when I came to software, it was literally the same model. So it's not a derivative of, it's not inspired by, it's the same model. This one is adapted slightly. So in the beginning, over on the left-hand side, we've got first, we create the content. Right. So this is kind of the conceptualization on our end of what comes to mind. What is the thing that we want to say? Then we encode that into a message, right? So we are either typing or we are verbalizing or we're gesturing. There's a lot of different ways that we can encode that meaning that we're trying to convey, right? and then we transmit it, right? So clicking send or actually saying it out loud, right? So then we move into, in Claude Shannon's model, there's only the information channel. And so this is like, he was working a lot with telephones. And so like thinking about how a telephone goes across a wire. But when we're thinking about our own communication channel, like right now it's through Zoom, I'm giving a webinar, right? This is through a video. And so those bits and bytes are kind of being transmitted across, time and space. But there's also a relationship channel that I think is important to remember as well. So when we think about, it's not just the content. So if we're doing a code review or we're giving someone some feedback, we don't just need to focus on the content. We need to think about how we share that content. How is that going to impact our relationship with this person? Then on the other end, we have the recipient, right? Who is the intended person who is supposed to be receiving this message? How are they interpreting it? So, in their mind, how are they decoding what your message is? And then, is that the understanding? And so when we have collaboration, there's just really high fidelity. So I say something, it makes sense. There are a lot of different places where this can fail, right? So we may have poor context. We may be operating under assumptions that just aren't true, right? And so if we do that, that's going to impact the way that we transmit a message. We may not be able to represent it, right? So, if we're just having a hard time, finding those words, that can make it challenging. We might be operating at really low capacity. So we're just exhausted. It's really hard to communicate when you're tired, when you're sick, right? When you're distracted. There's a lot of different things here where just you may not have the energy to communicate well. In terms of the channels, this is extra information that kind of distorts something. So when it comes to information, that's noise. But on the relationship, it can be that strain, right? So taking that into account, and then thinking about how is that likely to impact my message. On the recipient's end, right, they may have low capacity. You may craft the best message possible, but they're just tired and they're not able to interpret it, right? If I'm speaking in English, but you don't speak English, right, there can be some interpretation challenges there where, you may have to rely on another tool, and kind of the way that things get sent maybe aren't exactly the way that they're meant, right? And then poor integration. So maybe you heard the exact word, but, the way that you assigned that meaning was a challenge. And I think the other thing to think about is, this most, moderate to minimum, and misplaced. That's about how much control we have. So we have the most control over the messages that we send, the way that we think of things, the context and the research that we can gather, right? Taking care of ourselves so that we're operating at the best capacity as possible, right? That's where we can put our energy in. Moderate to minimum is the information channel, right? We may have some things here, if we're a startup, then we get to kind of choose what the default communication channels will be. But if we're operating within a large organization and they've got kind of established channels, we're not going to, have too much wiggle room in there. We might be able to, say, okay, a Zoom call versus Slack or an email. But, and then if there's a strained relationship, that's hard. And then when we're thinking about other people, I call this misplaced because we really don't have control at all about how the messages that we send are going to be received, right? The best we can do is learn from the failures and then integrate that into the next message that we send. So I know this is a lot, right? But, thinking through the communication system kind of as a process can be a really helpful way for us to, kind of optimize ahead of time. We can also think in terms of patterns and anti-patterns. So I will just kind of pause here. But, thinking about, am I shaming people, right? What is wrong with you? If we're on a team versus what happened. posturing expertise, that's where it's like, oh yeah, everyone knows that versus, kind of that humble reassurance where you're telling people, yeah, I had that happen to me too, right? Impulsive criticism. This is something that happens a lot. I know with me and my business partner, this is something that he tends to do. And it sometimes really hurts, especially if I'm in this like ideation phase. Like, what do you think about this? What is this? And I'm kind of externally processing. He might interrupt me and go, well, actually, that's not going to work. And depending on the type of feedback that I'm looking for, that can be really hurtful. But from his perspective, he's really trying to be helpful, right? It took us a long time, many years to kind of work through this. And so what we did was we kind of reframed it to more curious clarification. So if I'm, I'm just kind of on this, ideation rant, he's got these ideas and like he might pause me and say, okay, how do you want me to give you feedback right now? And sometimes it's like, I don't really want feedback. I kind of just like want your yes, no, kind of just seeing your face as you kind of look through these ideas. I don't need anything specific. And then we've described it as macro feedback versus micro feedback. So, I kind of just want feedback on kind of the broad themes versus like, please catch every single typo. And so, that practice of, kind of switching out the, well, actually to, how would you like that feedback? That's been really transformative. I won't go through all of the rest of these, but I know, kind of the last one is the one that I was most prone to, where it was like, just pretending like there are no problems, like everything's great, everything's fine. But really looking at things more pragmatically. And this is where retrospectives can be just magical. I think that's the most important meaning on an interaction on any Agile team. So, kind of looking at the process, but also looking at the patterns. Like when we start looking things on these more granular levels, we can start becoming more skilled in our communication. All right, so now let's start getting into some of those empathy domains. So we've got resonating, right? So this is that emotional connection. So with this, we want to recognize that there's a phenomenon called the empathy gap. And what this is that when we frame our identity around in-groups and out-groups, right? So, if we have a really strong idea of there are testers and they're like me, and there's, engineers and they're all, trying to make my life difficult or whatever, right? If we frame things in terms of rivalries, then what happens is that our levels of empathy increase for the people that we think are like us, but they decrease for the people who we think are like them. And there's several different places where these gaps might show up, right? So lived experience, right? So, if I grew up in like a really affluent place, in an urban setting, and I was able to go to university, and all of these different things versus, I grew up kind of with a feeling of food scarcity and resource scarcity in a very rural environment. I had to work hourly jobs to kind of make ends meet, so I wasn't able to go to university. Like those different lived experiences, based on kind of our situation, kind of the way that, our bodies are made up, like that can really make a big impact. Knowledge. So this is, if somebody has a degree in computer science versus somebody has a degree in business, right? The detailed information that you understand about that domain is going to be different. And there's going to be jargon, that you'll have to translate between different departments. So, if you're with a group and, you're all software engineers and you all practice test-driven development, then, using the term TDD makes a lot of sense, right? But if you're a cocktail party and, you run into someone who you went to school with and they're a nurse and you say TDD, they're likely to think about targeted drug, delivery. And so, recognizing that not everybody has the same knowledge that we do. Processing, mentioned I'm an external processor. So when I think about ideas, like I kind of need to say them out loud before I really can think them through. Other people are more internal processors. So they do a lot of quiet reflection first. There's also bottom up. So people who see the details first versus top down, or gestalt thinkers who see broad patterns first and then kind of fill in the details. There's ability. So, for me, I have a memory disability. And so there are just some things I can't do that, as much as I will try, I won't be able to achieve that level. And so different people have different abilities. And so being able to recognize those different things make a difference. We may have different values, right? So if you think back to that puppy, right? Like some people might value getting all of the details right. Other people might value, kind of going out and, pursuing this next new idea. And those can be really in conflict. We see this kind of on political spectrums too, but, we can see this on our teams, and being able to negotiate becomes really challenging if we just become entrenched in our values. And don't learn to explore kind of the motivation and why. And then finally is motivation. Some people are really motivated by money. Some people are really motivated by making an impact, right? And so, recognizing kind of where those different gaps are. There's also some technical details that matter. So this is some research from Daniel Batson. And so the way that empathy is sometimes described is it's walking in another person's shoes. It's imagining yourself the way that, someone else would be. That's not quite accurate. And so, I often describe empathy as a technical skill, and these are some of the things why. So when we imagine other, it's more about like, how would they feel, right? And so it's listening. It's not necessarily imagining the situational details, but it's more connecting to, wow, that's really frustrating. I can relate to that frustration, rather than imagining yourself literally and kind of visualizing in somebody else's shoes, right? And so that's the, how would I feel in their situation? And if we do the imagine other, that's the way we want to. It motivates you to help. It helps you kind of relieve some distress, and it helps you approach situations with a more open-minded understanding. But if we do this like, kind of colloquial style of empathy, where we're literally imagining ourselves in another person's situation, then we kind of feel stressed out, right? Because we might be feeling that pain. And so it actually motivates us to help ourselves and kind of move away from the person that we're trying to help. And it's also a projection of your own feelings. So there's a lot of bias that you're bringing to the table too. So these are some of those technical details. All right, let's look at impulse control and kind of some specific practices here. So this is capacity, right? And we talked about this before. Distress destroys empathy. If we are stressed out, if we're feeling like we're operating at low capacity, then we will move away from empathy, right? And there's lots of different types of distress. Here's, kind of 5. So situational distress, like this might be you lost your job, or, you are just experiencing a lot of tension on your team, or, it might be something personal that's going on, but you're going to bring that situation to, whatever interactions you have. And so, on a team, this is why, like, if you're motivating based off of shame and, kind of creating that culture of just clutter, this doesn't really work because it stresses everybody out, and then you're not able to have that empathy. Physical, so we talked about this a little bit. So this is, if you're sick, if you're tired, if you're not hydrated, right? If you just feel exhausted, that can play a role. Emotional distress. So this is like just feeling like this has to do with your emotions. And there's been some studies recently that we experience emotional pain in the same way sometimes that we experience physical pain, right? So, if somebody does something that just like really hurts our feelings and makes us feel small or makes us feel shame, right? That can have a very real impact on our ability to empathize. Empathic distress, this is a specific type of emotional distress where we've given so much to somebody that we are tapped out, right? And so helping other people, relating to other people, running this empathy machine takes energy. And so if we're depleted, we don't have, that compassion, we don't have that ability to, communicate, like we're just going to be exhausted. And so recognizing that is important so that we give, but without giving too much. And then there's social distress, right? So kind of, seeing everybody else having fun and we feel left out, right? Or there's just a lot of pressure to conform, right? And, be part of the group. So, there can be some social distress where it's like we want people to like us. So, we might feel stressed out because we want to fit in. And reappraisal. So this is taking a moment to reconsider our initial assessment and a response. So, this comes in with kind of that impulse control, because if we only operate based on kind of our gut instinct and our first response, right, it might be, kind of the example I give is that, I can be working and when I work, I have a like really focused face, and my face kind of gets a little furrowed and kind of my eyes squint a little bit. And people can think that I'm mad based on kind of the way my face is configured, but I'm not. I'm just like really focused on whatever problem I'm working on. And so, if I tell someone, right, oh no, that's just my focus face, their first instinct might still be, oh, Andrea's mad. But then going, wait a second, she told me this, so let me think about it. So the recognizing and kind of taking that pause and thinking through what are some other options, this becomes so critical. And it has some really big benefits for you as an individual too. So people who regularly practice this in different situations, they tend to experience more positive emotions. They're healthier. They report higher levels of satisfaction with their life. They have closer relationships with their peers. They have more social support. They're able to bounce back from challenges. So again, this is kind of a small practice that you can start right away. Just like when you notice something and you're like, oh, they did that because of this, being like, oh, wait, that's an assumption I'm making. What are some other things that could have happened? Right. I was working with, kind of a tester who was having a really difficult challenge with the engineer that he was working with, and was frustrated that this engineer was kind of skipping some of the details of, his very thorough test plans. And he was recognizing, oh, actually, this person's boss rides them a lot and doesn't give them a lot of time. And then they work together to kind of come up with a new process. So that's an example of a reappraisal, rather than just getting mad at that person. They're like, oh, they don't care because they're not, reading my thorough test plan. Like, what are some other reasons that could be? Next is critical thinking. And so this is thinking about kind of like, what is the interconnectedness? And so I know software developers have been trained a lot of times to think about the implementation. And this is important, right? We don't want to get rid of this. We need things to work, right? But this is taking the perspective of like, make the compiler happy. Like, I want to make sure that my source code compiles, that, the feature that I'm looking for works, that all the tests pass, right? And so that's the implementation. And so thinking through, how is this thing going to work? That's important. Next, in terms of empathy and perspective taking, we might think about the customer, right? So there's user experience, customer experience, developer experience, whatever experience, this is going to be in that interaction place where we're thinking about making that person happy, making them, making their lives a little better. But it's really more on kind of who are we interacting with? Who is interacting with our work? And then there's also impact. So this is making a difference. So not everybody who is impacted by what we build will interact with what we build. So an example would be if we're working on, some algorithms or, data models that help bankers determine mortgages, right? The person who's interacting with that software that we're creating is the banker, right? They're our customer, but then the people who are going to, that banker determines and uses our software to figure out whether or not somebody gets a mortgage, they're the people who are going to be impacted by our work. So we need to think about kind of, not just the work that we're doing and making sure that the compiler is happy, and not just the customers and kind of the people that we interact with, but kind of taking it one step further and imagining what is that impact going to be. And so reasoning and kind of thinking through this in kind of an analytical way becomes important. All right, next is reflecting. So this is assessing our initial inferences. This I talked about briefly. So this is benchmarking our accuracy, right? How accurate are we in terms of actually figuring out what somebody else is feeling? And like I said, the baseline for empathic accuracy would be 5%, but kind of across the board, the average would be that with strangers, it's about 20%. So it's significantly more than chance, right? This is kind of some of the evolutionary things that our, bodies have optimized empathy for. But, there's a limit. We're not ever going to be 100%. And so there are people, I know I used to identify this where I thought I was just so good at this and I didn't think I needed to actually check in to see how people were feeling because I just felt so confident in my ability. And I also had people tell me, oh, you're really good at reading people. You're really good at kind of walking to a room and just knowing. And, this kind of was a big, huge slice of humble pie when I came across this research. But it's also if you think that you're not so great at it, right? I meet a lot of people and they're comparing themselves to, oh, I should be getting it in the 85%. I should be getting it right more than I get it wrong. No, actually, you're probably spot on. So kind of benchmarking our ability level. And William Ikes is the one who is the researcher who really focuses on this. It's also helpful to think about prediction errors and how we're learning and thinking about feedback, right? So when we get feedback, it significantly improves our levels of empathic accuracy. So if we're trying to get better and improve our accuracy level, especially with somebody that we don't know very well, right? This help me understand becomes a really powerful statement, right? And then when we're able to regulate our emotions and kind of think through things and, do the perspective taking, right? This helps us understand and get that information. And kind of the neuroscience is starting to show that the way that we incorporate new information into our brains is similar to kind of how we, resolve differences in, a source controlled system like Git. So first we make a prediction, right? Next is what's called simulation. So this is imagining, dreaming, things like that. There's some evidence that we kind of simulate right before we do things, even if we're not consciously aware of it. Then we compare, right? So this is where those reappraisals can be helpful. So it's oh, my prediction is that Andrea is really angry, right? Because her face looks like that. Well, wait a second, she told me this, and I'm going to choose to resolve the error. I'm going to choose to believe that she's focused, or I'm going to reject that information, right? So the more that we can get information around that compare stage where it's okay, help me understand, then we can think through, okay, I'm going to learn, let me incorporate that. Responding. So this is our shared support. This is described as pro-social behavior. And when we are giving oriented, right, we are especially on the team level, when most people default to generosity, but without giving too much, right? Paying attention to their capacity, setting good boundaries. So it's kind of healthy giving. They're more effective at sharing information, sustaining motivation, negotiating how work is distributed, managing the resources, and ultimately maximizing the value they deliver. And individual members tend to have more capacity. So this can be a very virtuous cycle. But we need kind of all of those other elements in place in order to get here. But you can start to see where this really starts to become some of those collaboration qualities that we're going for. And, some criteria for if we're hitting that pro-social behavior is, it's healthy. Like, people aren't giving too much. They're setting healthy boundaries. Managerial influence. So, that's one of the most important things, is, do managers model this? Do they make sure that it's kind of part of how the team operates? Perceived justice. This is about fairness, right? So, like, if we feel like somebody else got off the hook or is being treated differently or is getting preferential treatment, then that's going to demotivate us to operate with empathy and, help them. Psychological safety, which is, the group feels safe for interpersonal risk taking. They feel like they can speak up without being shamed or ignored or made to feel ignorant or things like that. Recognizing the impact of different behaviors and kind of actions, and then also signals of appreciation. There's also some research around open source projects, and manners tend to matter. So open source projects where people are kind and say, please and thank you, and, kind of have these signals of appreciation, they actually solve problems faster. They're able to fix bugs more quickly. It really does impact the quality of the work and the throughput of how we're able to deliver. And then last one is resourcing. So this is our motivation optimization. So thinking about things as a system. And when we're thinking about motivation, really it's about trade-offs. And there's two different kind of ways that we make trade-offs when we're navigating the world. The first one is avoid or approach. Do I want to move towards something or away from something, right? And we do this all the time, right, in our world. But it could be like we're walking, by someone and they're crying, and we just like don't have the energy to see what's going on. It's too much for us. And so we might avoid it, right? Whereas if we are feeling like there's enough capacity, if we feel like we have time, right? There's a lot of different kind of nuances here around, like, if we feel like and this kind of gets back into the capacity, like if we feel like we don't understand them, or if we feel like we're just have to go, and we don't have any time. If we feel like that's against the values of the team that we're working on, and it's kind of just like, we'll buck it up, like it's not my problem, right? Then we're going to avoid it. But approaching really is kind of that moving towards connection, moving towards wanting to help. We also have explore and exploit. So exploit is leaning on information that you already have to make quick actions. And explore is that help me understand. Now, we do need to balance this. Like, if we're constantly in an explore space, we're never actually going to do anything. But if all we do is operate off of our, initial impulse and instinct, we're not going to learn, right? So in general, moving things towards the approach and explore kind of motivation and setting up the cultural systems and the, team behaviors that are expected, the behavioral norms, that can move us towards empathy, because we're going to increase our capacity. We're going to have the time, right? All of those things. So I know that's a lot, but I'm glad this is being recorded so that you can go back and look. I do like to make sure that, the advice that I give, it's very practical and tactical and implementable. So, kind of thinking through all of this, the idea is that without true collaboration, this is why Agile efforts fail, right? Agile isn't a methodology. It's, kind of, and you can see that, or, kind of SAFe and Scrum and kind of all of these different methodologies. That's not Agile. It's how are we showing up on our teams? And, some examples of kind of when it's not working, when we're in that clashing and cluttering kind of place, it's, don't blame me. It's the business. They're the ones who are the problem. I didn't have anything to do with it. Or I have no time to actually focus on my work, so I guess I'll have to do it here in this meeting, so I can't fully pay attention. Not having psychological safety, so this person might have a really critical insight, but if they don't feel like it's safe for them to speak up or they're going to be shamed, they're not gonna. Thinking like, oh, this is a complete waste of time, right? They're not going to be motivated to approach empathy. And then also, I was triple booked. So even though I should be here, like I'm not, because I had to choose. So, this is that cluttering. And then, if that person is a really critical decision maker or, a person who really needs to be there, then this team isn't going to actually be able to move forward on that collaboration and productive output. And, compassion, communication, and empathy, they're really essential to making Agile work. And so, when we have all of these things, and if you've been on that team where it like everything's clicking and everything's working, it tends to feel like this, like we're using like, hey, thanks for catching that edge case. I, overlooked it. You're doing your job really well. Great idea. What resources would you need to implement it, right? So thinking about a culture of experimentation and really giving people the tools that they need to make those experiments a reality. This was a really productive retrospective, thinking about you learned, right? You have that psychological safety, you're hearing from other people, feeling like the work you're doing matters and that you're making a difference. And then, wow, we accomplished so much, enjoy your weekend, like you take time to rest, so that we can go at that sustainable pace. And, what a difference between, the other example, which I think is pretty normal, and this. And to me, empathy and communication and collaboration, like all of that is how we get to this level of collaboration. So Agile isn't a methodology and it's a framework, it's empathy. And empathy, again, it's that engine that turns compassionate communication into collaboration. And the reason that we use it is so that we can work together and solve complex problems together. So I hope that this is helpful. I can't wait to hear how you bring this to your team. And, here's some of my information. I do keynotes and trainings and stuff like that. I'm currently booking it for 2024. So if you have any interest, you can reach out. If you do try to connect with me on LinkedIn, make sure you mention this presentation either in a note or you can email me at hello.hardware.dev. I just started a Substack. I launched another community called Empathy in Tech. So if you want to be in a community of folks who are kind of all trying to make this work, you can do that too.